Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video we're going to do a build and review of Tamiya's 1/72nd scale Messerschmitt Bf109 G6. So I've previously done an inbox review of this kit and several other Bf109Fs and Gs. This is sort of part of an ongoing series where I have a look at some other kits in 72nd scale and compare them, and today we'll be building this one and seeing how it goes. I started this kit, as always, with giving all the sprues a good wash in some warm soapy water to help remove any residue off the parts so that paint and glue would adhere to the model more easily. It's also a good idea to wash your own hands as well. I begin assembly with the cockpit, first cutting out the various parts and the fuselage halves from their sprue using a set of Tamiya side cutters. The moulding is very clean on this kit, and I also found that most of the points where the sprues attach to parts were easy to cut without requiring much cleanup in terms of sanding. First of all, I glued the base of the seat to the main floor section along with the joystick and the bulge which covers the cannon. I attach the forward bulkhead, which has the rudder pedals moulded to the wall, and once it's glued to the floor, I then attach the main instrument panel to it. The side wheels also have some additional parts, including throttle quadrant with the moulded levers, and on the other side a fuse box and the oxygen system. The rear bulkhead for the cockpit, where the canopy sits, comes as a separate piece, which slots very nicely to the fuselage halves. I glue it into place and gently dabbed away any of the excess glue from it and then set the cockpit parts aside. I then turned my attention to the wing halves, cutting out first the lower section and then the two upper wing halves and the two radiators. The parts are all very cleanly moulded for these as well, but I still had to give the leading and trail edges a bit of a sand to remove any remnants of the sprue joints. There was one awkwardly placed joint on the underside of the upper wing halves, which took a little bit of filing and cutting to remove so that there wouldn't be a gap between the wing halves. I then glue the upper and lower wings together. These parts also fitted together perfectly with virtually no gap whatsoever. After they were in place, I then glued the underwing radiators and then got my brush out for some painting. I started off with painting both the interior of the cockpit and also the landing gear bays with Tamiya XF24 dark grey. All of the paints that I use are water-based acrylics, so to thin them down I mix the paint with a little bit of water to make it less thick, but not so much water that the paint runs out of control. I then begin to apply it onto the areas that I want dark grey. I do 3 coats of this colour, building it up in several layers until it is nice and uniform. This is better than doing one thick sloppy coat and risking losing all the wonderful moulded details, or just doing one coat that's way too thin and ending up with obvious paint streaks in areas where the original plastic colour is showing through. Next, I get out my very fine SMS brushes and begin to paint the little details. I use various colours, including Vallejo Vermillion Red for various details, including the buttons and switches, XF9 Hull Red for leather on the control stick and also the gun sight area, Vallejo Silver for some of the switches, flat yellow for various buttons and also the fuel line that runs on the right side of the cockpit wall, and finally some sky blue for the oxygen system. If I make any mistakes, I then touch them up with a bit of XF24. I added a few additional details after I'd finished this first layer of detailing using some Vallejo flat black and also a bit of XF52 flat earth to lighten up some of the hull red. With all the details painted, I then get out some Tamiya XF16 flat aluminium and I dab it onto the seat, the floor and some of the raised areas to create some metal chipping and scratches inside of the cockpit. Once the chipping has dried, I go back over some of the areas where it is with a bit of XF24 to reduce how much metal chipping there is and also to create a bit of a layer effect so the metal scratches appear to be underneath the main layer of paint. The Tamiya kit includes some very nice decals for both the instrument panel and also a set of seat belts. I cut them out of the decal sheet and then stick them in a little bit of water, and once the transfers start to come loose off the paper, I get them out and slide them into place using a paintbrush. To help them soften onto the raised details, especially on the main instrument panel, I then dab them with some Vallejo decal softener and also later some Tamiya Decal adhesive to help them also stick to the model. I leave the decals to dry for a couple of hours and then I get out some Tamiya black panel liner scent and apply it onto the walls and floor of the cockpit. This enamel based wash will then flow into all of the recessed details and help to highlight them. The panel liner is still a bit thick in some areas, so once it's visibly dried, I then get out a cotton bud and dip it in some enamel thinners to wipe away the excess wash. I dab it only on the raised areas and areas that are a little bit too dark so that I'm still left with a fair bit of wash in all of the gaps. Once the enamel thinners have dried, which doesn't take too long, I could then glue the fuselage halves together. I run a bead of glue along one of the halves and then join them together, and after holding them for a moment I then slotted the cockpit floor from underneath into them and then applied some glue along the joints. The cockpit floor fitted exceptionally well, so I quickly then added some extra glue along where the wings join, and then I slid the wings into place and used a bulldog clip to hold the fuselage halves while they dried. I added on the single piece that makes up both horizontal stabilizers before then sliding the tail into its slot and adding the tail wheel at the back of the aircraft. All of these parts were very nicely moulded, and the rather unusual tail assembly was very well designed and fitted perfectly. Moving on to the main landing gear, I cut out the struts, wheels and the fairings and glued the struts to their position under the wings. The struts have a large section of the underside of the wings moulded to them, which means that they are very strong and it's nearly impossible to have them glued in at the wrong angle. But given the instructions don't give an option for the undercarriage retracted and this type of assembly, I suspect it means you can't have the gear in the retracted position without a little bit of modification. Another unusual feature of this kit is the way the engine cowling is made. Rather than moulding the engine cowling details to the fuselage like most other kits, instead you get 3 separate pieces which you have to glue onto a rough framework. This may be advantageous for moulding the details on the cowling pieces, but it seems to me to be a bit of an odd choice for assembly. Theoretically you could find or 3D print an engine and use the cowlings in an open position, but you would have to do a lot of modifying of the forward fuselage. It would have been nice if Tamiya did what Airfix did with their newer Bf109 E4 and have a moulded engine detail inside of the cowling with the cowling parts fitting over them, but it might not have been possible with this kit. Moving on to the forward radiator, I cut out both the radiator part and the cowling that covers it, which required a fair bit of cleanup to remove the sprue attachments which were in a bit of an awkward spot, before then gluing them into place. At this stage, I added the smaller details like the underbelly pylon for the fuel tank, the pitot tube, the circular antenna behind the canopy, and the supercharger for the air intake. All of these parts fitted well, but unfortunately I would later knock off the pitot tube and lose it while painting. I probably should have left it off until I was done handling the model, but fortunately I could later replace it. The final major part to assemble was the propeller. In typical Tamiya fashion, the prop is attached using a polycap, which you install into the prop blade part and then glue that to the base and then place the spinning fairing over the top of it. I personally prefer the polycap design that Tamiya use over the more common washer or pin style, because with polycaps you can easily remove the propeller assembly for painting or transport, and they also still slide back on very easily and they seem to fit much nicer while still being able to rotate. Finally, I was ready to fill in a few of the tiny gaps on this model using some Vallejo water-based putty, and once that had dried, I then used some fine sandpaper to sand away the excess putty and any seam lines. I then rescored any of the panel lines which I might have lost during the sanding process, and the model was ready for some painting. I chose to do the scheme featured on the box from JG51 based in Bulgaria during June of 1944. I started my painting with the lightest colour, which in this case would be the light blue RLM 76 underside. For German colours, I like to use the AK Interactive Gen 3 water-based acrylics, because the finish of these paints seems to be really good, especially when you brush paint them with many thin layers. I squeeze a bit of the paint into a plastic cup and then mix the paints with some water to help thin them down. I then apply them onto the model using a brush, making strokes reasonably quickly since these paints tend to dry quite fast, and as much as possible in the same direction from nose to tail. This helps to create a smoother finish and reduces the amount of brush marks you get. Being such a light colour, it takes quite a large number of coats for the RLM76 before it becomes nice and uniform and you can't see any of the dark grey plastic showing through. In the end, I did up to 6 coats initially before I was happy with the result. The next colour I painted on was the lightest colour for the 2 tones on the upper surface, RLM75. Again, I squeezed some into a plastic cup and then thin it down with some water before applying it onto the upper surface of the model. For this colour initially I use a smaller brush to apply the paint especially on the fuselage and wings so that I can control how thick my lines are more easily. With this scheme I really wanted more of a flowy look to the upper surface colours on the fuselage rather than a really straight line, so I made sure to paint the lines with a little bit of a curve to it. For the wings I wanted a more solid line where the 75 and the 76 meet, so I carefully painted along that panel line trying to keep it as neat and straight as possible. I did a second coat of RLM75, this time with a larger brush since the lines I'd done previously were nice and defined by the first coat. Once the second coat had dried, I decided to then paint the darker camouflage colour, which is RLM74. Unlike the 76 and 75 where I apply the paint all in the same direction as much as possible, with the RLM74 I instead apply the outline for the areas where I wanted to create the darker camouflage shapes, and then I fill them in. I still try to paint from the direction of the nose to the tail or the other way as much as possible, but sometimes it is easier to just follow the camouflage shape and make sure the paints are nice and thin so that they flow well and don't leave any thick lines. After the first coat of RLM74 has dried, I follow it up with a second and then a third coat until I'm happy with how solid and dark the second camouflage colour looks. I know many people who refuse to do modelling with a brush, but with a bit of control and technique, I believe you can still get a very satisfactory result using a brush. My preferred technique is to get a smaller brush and apply a rather thin layer of the darker mottled shapes. In this case it was RLM74 and 75, which I applied onto the sides of the fuselage. In this particular scheme the modelling appeared to be quite large and with some soft shapes, so I created the rather large and oval-like patterns of the shapes with varying sizes and filled up the fuselage until I was happy with how it looked. I then softened the effect by applying a very thin coat of RLM76 over the top. I also softened the edges of the camouflage line by allowing a little bit of overlap between the RLM76 and the darker camouflage colours. I continued painting with the RLM76 on the underside, effectively giving the aircraft a 6th layer of this colour. Then, to neaten up any areas where I accidentally brushed some of the RLM76 into the wrong spot, or where there was any overlap I didn't want, I used a very fine brush to apply some of the RLM75 or 74 into the areas to neaten them up. I painted the main wheels at this stage with an initial coat of Vallejo flat black in between applying the camouflage colours. I then decided to do a second layer of modelling to make it a little bit stronger. To do this, I repeated the process, again dabbing the darker shapes with RLM74 and 75, and while it dried I painted the propeller and spinner a coat of RLM70. I then softened the modelling once more with a light coat of RLM76 over the top, and this time I was pretty satisfied with the results. I applied several more coats of the RLM70 onto the propeller assembly, and with the camouflage completed, I started to paint the identification markings according to the Tamiya instructions. This included some yellow on the engine cowling, and a bit of white for the tail, the underside wing bands, and a section of the spinner. Interestingly, this aircraft was operated on the Eastern Front, and normally German aircraft operating there had yellow identification bands on the underside of the wings and the fuselage, but instead this aircraft has white ones, which I believe were used for the Mediterranean theatre. I decided to go with the white as the instructions said anyways, which could potentially be a mistake, or perhaps with many things in modelling this aircraft was an exception to the rules. White and yellow both require a fairly large number of thin coats, as they are very light colours, so it took quite a fair few layers before the results became nice and solid and uniform. In between applying coats of yellow and white, I also painted the underside of the landing gear bay another coat of XF24 dark grey. I initially went with Tamiya X1 gloss black for the hubs of the wheels, but I later decided to switch it to XF24 dark grey, and I painted the strut for the landing gear XF16 flat aluminium. At this stage, I was ready to apply the decals. I use my regular technique of cutting out the sections of the decal sheet and then sticking them in some slightly warmed water for around about 20 seconds, and then sticking them onto some paper towel. Once the decals start to lift off the paper, I then use a brush to apply some water to the spot where I wish to place the decal, and then I slide the decal off the paper with said brush and move it into place. Once all the decals are in place, I then use a cotton tip to dab on some Vallejo decal softener before applying some Tamiya Decal adhesive. This helps the decals to both soften and also adhere to the surface of the model to help show the surface detail underneath and give them a realistic painted on effect. Unfortunately, I found the decals to be a bit of a letdown in this kit. They seemed to be very thick, and as a result they wouldn't show a lot of the surface detail even after the Vallejo decal softener, and later after they dried they also ended up silvering quite a lot. I know it's often a good idea to apply gloss coats before applying the decals to prevent silvering, and after doing this model I think I might start to do that as standard, but I find it's pretty rare to come across any decals that silver in the first place, especially ones that silver this badly. I almost considered painting the eyes that go on the cannon bulges because they didn't fit very nicely, especially because they were so thick and the bulges were quite curved, but I didn't really feel like tearing the decals off and then having to try and paint them. While the decals dried, I cut out the transparent canopy parts and the gun sight and carefully painted the edges of the frame XF24 dark grey, which was the colour I wanted for the inside of the frame. Later I then painted over the dark grey with the external colour. I painted and installed the gun sight and then waited for around about 12 hours for the decals to settle before then applying a coat of Vallejo water-based matte varnish in much the same fashion I did with the paints. Normally this gives a uniform finish, giving the impression that the decals were painted onto the aircraft, but with the silvering it wasn't really looking as good as I wanted it to be, especially on the wings and the clear areas where the walkway markings were, which were rather obvious. I ended up deciding to paint over them with the camouflage colours, doing my best to not overpaint the decals. It worked out okay with the balcony cross, but it wasn't so good with the walkway markings because they were so small. I then gave the spinner a final coat of RLM 70 and painted the canopy frames a coat of RLM 74 and 75 before applying another coat of matte varnish onto the model again to help things blend in. The canopy and the armoured headrest received one final coat of paint, and then I got out a cocktail stick and carefully scratched away any excess paint from the areas that I wanted to keep transparent. Some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue was then used to glue the clear parts into place. This glue is quite similar to super glue or regular CA, but it won't fog up the canopies, and it also has a longer working time, although it is still quite short. I accidentally got some of the glue on my fingers, and then unfortunately touched one of the canopy frames with it, leaving a nasty smudge from all the glue. With most other glues, this would make the canopy an instant write-off, but fortunately with the Deluxe Material glues, I could wait until it had dried, and then I could scratch away the excess without it leaving much of a trace. Unfortunately though, the canopy frames didn't really fit too well unless in the open position. Some light sanding did slightly improve things, but given how fuss-free the rest of the kit went together, it was a bit of a disappointment to encounter this. I re-glued the tail wheel, which some of you eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed got knocked off during the painting, and then I began the weathering process. I started off with creating some metal chipping using Tamiya's XF16 flat aluminium. I get a bit of the paint on my brush and then dab away some of the excess on paper towel before then dabbing it onto the model in the places I want to have some chipped paint. These include the leading edges of the wing, prop blades, horizontal and vertical stabilizers, and other edges of surfaces which would be exposed directly to air resistance, also along the moving edges of surfaces such as the wheel well, the gear fairings, the edges of the flaps, the slats, the radiators, and the metal edges around fabric control surfaces. The other area I apply a bit in is along some of the random panel lines, the access hatches which could get easily scratched during routine maintenance by tools and mechanics, and the walkway where the pilot or ground crew could damage the paint with regular use. While I have it out, I also painted the machine guns, the landing gear struts, and the tail wheel with the flat aluminium. I purposefully overdid the metal chipping because I like to then get a bit of whatever colour I applied the metal chipping over the top of, be it RLM 76 or flat yellow, and then use a fine brush to gently dab some of that base colour over the edges of the metal chipping. Not only does this reduce how much metal chipping there is, thus toning down the effect and making it a little bit more realistic, but it also creates a distressed look around the layers of the paint, making it look like the paint has worn away rather than just been chipped off without leaving any marks. This effect also makes the paint look like it's over the top of the metal chipping and has gotten worn away, rather than the metal chipping has been applied over the top of it later, creating a nice layered effect. Once the chipping has been softened, I then paint the tyre of the tail and main wheels with a coat of flat black. I decided to leave the exhausts, the fuel tank and some of the other small parts on the sprue to make painting the aircraft a little bit easier. I painted the parts that I'd left on the sprue using various colours, including RLM76 for the various small control linkages and the fuel tank, and also X31 Titan Gold for the exhausts. The tail wheel has a little bit of a leather pouch kind of thing that covers the upper section of the landing gear, so I painted that XF52 Flat Earth. I decided to do another coat of white on the spinner and the underwing markings to make them a little bit more solid, and also change the hub colour for the main wheels from X1 Gloss to XF24 Dark Grey. As you can see, however, unfortunately I'd been a little bit too thick with applying paint to the left wheel. Luckily though, I had a solution. To fix this, I got out some Tamiya paint remover and very carefully rubbed some with a cotton bud onto the left wheel. I then wiped it away with some paper towel, and this removes most of the paint from the wheel. I let it dry for a couple of hours, and then I could repaint the wheel with XF24 Dark Grey and Vallejo Flat Black. I apply a second coat of RLM76 and Titan Gold onto the sprue parts, and then create some post shading and grime effects using some black panel liner scent. To do this, I apply it over the entire model, making sure to cover all the panel lines and gaps with it, and then I give it a few minutes to dry before going over the top of it with some enamel thinners to soften the effect. With the first layer of enamel thinners, I drag it from nose to tail or tail to nose so that any streaks will be appearing in the direction of the airflow. After waiting a few more minutes for the reactivated panel liner to then dry, I once again use the cotton bud to apply more of the enamel thinners. This time though, I rub from the middle of the panel lines outwards, which removes the panel liner from the centre of them and starts to push the panel line into all of the gaps. This makes the model less dark and also creates a soft blending along all the edges of the panel lines, giving a really nice post shading effect in my opinion. It's nice and subtle on the upper surfaces of the aircraft with the darker camouflage colours, but admittedly it is a bit strong on the lighter underside. I'm still very happy with the effect, although you could probably tone it down using a dark grey panel line colour instead of the black on the underside. The last bit of weathering I do to the aircraft is to get some Tamiya water-based weathering master powders out, and using a fine brush I dab it in various areas to create some different effects. I dab some of the black onto the machine guns and the cannon barrel to create some gun smoke stains, and I also apply the black in a slight swirling motion streaking backwards from the exhaust area to create some exhaust streaks. On the underside of the aircraft, I drag some of the black from the flaps and radiators backwards to create some grease leaks and grime streaking effects. I dab a bit of white to add a slight burnt effect to the metal areas behind the exhausts, and then I use a mixture of rust, sand and the mud powders on the wheels to give a light coat of dirt on them as though the aircraft had flown out of some unprepared dry grass or dirt strips. I also use the mud pigment mixed with a bit of extra water to make it nice and thick, and dab it around the areas such as the landing gear bay, the rudder just behind the tail wheel, and the landing gear fairings to give an impression of some dirt getting flicked up by the wheels and ending up on the airframe. Finally, I use some rust pigment to add some extra colour streaks coming from the radiators from the coolant, and then I cut out and attach the exhausts, assemble the fuel tank halves, add the control balances and the fragile radio antenna to the airframe. I decided to use a bit of blue tack to hold the fuel tank temporarily on the model while I give it another coat of RLM76, before then removing it and giving it a coat of the black panel liner. The exhausts also received some of the panel liner, and once the panel liner had dried on the drop tank, I then used the same technique as I had with the aircraft and removed the excess using some X-20 enamel thinners. The last bit of weathering I did was based on some reference photos I saw of fuel streaks coming out of the fuel cap. I used a bit of the Weathering Master Powder's Black and Rust to add these streaks coming out of the area where the fuel cap was, with a few extra ones streaking backwards in the direction of the airflow. The exhausts received some rust and black pigments to give them a worn and burnt look, and then I attempted to add some rigging. A friend of mine recently ordered me some EZ line for rigging, so I decided to try and use it on this aircraft. I wasn't very happy with the EZ line for several reasons. First of all, I probably should have asked for the thin stuff rather than the heavy stuff, because it is definitely way too thick for 1/72nd scale. And in the end it put so much tension on the main antenna from behind the canopy it started to pull it back. It also seemed to fray and break a lot when I tried to cut it into the sections I want and stretch it out. Plus, I'm not really happy with how it looked, so in the end I may just remove it and get some finer but more expensive stuff, or instead perhaps I could use some of the hairs that I pulled out of my scalp while trying to do this for the rigging. Finally, I replaced the pitot tube, and with that, the Tamiya Bf109 G6 in 1/72nd scale was finally completed. This kit was a bit of a mixed bag for me in the end. On one hand, assembly was for the most part very easy. The fit and detail and engineering for the main assembly and finer details are probably the best of any 109 I've seen so far in 1/72nd scale. However, the kit really lets itself down with the thick and the silvery decals, and the fit of the canopy was pretty bad compared to the rest of the kit. I fortunately got this kit secondhand from a friend of mine for only $20, which for this kit I would say is a pretty good price. The silvering could be explained perhaps by this kit being secondhand, but even so, it couldn't have been more than 5 years old, and I've definitely done much older secondhand kits with decals that didn't silver as bad, and being secondhand wouldn't explain why the decals were so thick. It seems to me to be more of a issue in terms of quality rather than the age of this kit or the fact that I bought it secondhand. I am still happy with the results I achieved, especially the paint job, despite having to deal with the silver decals after they were applied, and the post shading, while maybe a bit heavy, I was still quite happy with. I'm sure a more experienced modeler could definitely get a far better result than I managed with this kit, but even so, I probably wouldn't recommend this kit given its way too high a price. In Australia brand new, this kit retails for around 35 to 45 AUD, which pretty much makes it the most expensive 109 kit in 1/72nd, and in my opinion is absolutely insane. I would expect much better quality for the decals, and probably a bit more detail and also some extra options like a retractable undercarriage, maybe some masks or even some photo etching for that price. But for $20 I can accept its faults and be happy with the model that I made, and be grateful for the relaxing and satisfying time I had creating it. Thank you very much for watching this video. I sincerely hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like, and if you have any suggestions on how I can improve or any questions, leave them down in the comment section below. Big shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund buying these kits and the suppliers that I use. There's plenty more videos coming, including some on the other 109s that I've previously done inbox reviews of that I have to at some point build and also do a review for, so stay tuned for more of those. Still gradually working on some of the other projects. Hopefully next week, if not then definitely the week after, I will have a stop motion coming out. Just a short little one that I've been doing some tests with some different techniques, which will be nice. I haven't had one of those released in, I think it's been 4 months now, which is way too long. But yeah, oh well, it happens. Thanks again for watching, and as always, take care, and until the next video, model on.